The snow battered the city like a living beast, shrieking against the hollow alleyways and deserted streets. Jacob stumbled forward, each step a desperate battle against the wind that clawed at him mercilessly. His breath came out in ragged clouds, immediately snatched away by the cold. Ice clung to his eyelashes, blurring the flickering streetlights into hazy halos. All around him, the world felt abandoned, a frozen wasteland where even hope seemed to have turned to ice. His boots, long worn thin, barely shielded him from the biting pavement beneath. Every step felt heavier, as if the cold had seeped into his very bones, weighing down not just his body but his spirit too. Still, he pressed on, driven by nothing but instinct. Jacob's jacket, a tattered remnant from better days, clung desperately to his shivering frame, offering little more than a cruel illusion of warmth. The freezing night slipped easily through the frayed seams, slicing into his skin like 1,000 tiny knives. His fingers, numb and stiff, curled into his palms in a futile attempt to preserve feeling. Every gust of wind felt like a slap, every drifting snowflake a mocking reminder of his fragility. He wrapped his arms around himself tighter, stumbling onward with teeth chattering uncontrollably, the bitter cold gnawing at the edges of his consciousness like a slow, merciless predator. Once, not so long ago, Jacob had carried dreams as vibrant as the morning sun. He had believed in the kindness of strangers, the promise of a future painted with hard work and hope. But life had a way of eroding even the strongest foundations. One lost job became two. One missed rent payment became an eviction. Now the dreams were distant echoes, fragile and broken, buried beneath the weight of survival. His stomach gnawed at him, hollow and relentless, and the only warmth he could remember was the distant feeling of a home he no longer had, fading like mist in a cruel winter. Above him, the city's steel giants loomed, their windows ablaze with life and warmth he could no longer touch. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses, all muffled sounds behind thick glass and closed doors. Each glowing window felt like a personal slight, a reminder of how far he had fallen. Amidst the luxury and comfort that stretched into the sky, Jacob was nothing but a shadow, invisible and forgotten. The city had moved on without him, and he, lost among its cracks, trudged on unseen. Jacob hunched further into himself, pulling his thin collar up against the brutal wind. His eyes, red and dry, scanned the endless expanse of alleyways and abandoned stoops. A doorway, a crate, even an overhang, anything to break the endless assault of snow and ice. His movements grew more frantic, more desperate, as the creeping numbness turned his limbs to lead. Somewhere, deep inside, he knew the clock was ticking. If he didn't find shelter soon, the cold would finish what life had started. Just as he prepared to surrender to exhaustion, a sound cut through the chaos. A soft, almost imperceptible whimper. Jacob froze, his heart skipping a beat. The wind screamed past him, but there it was again, threading its way through the storm, a fragile, trembling cry. For a moment, he thought it might be his mind playing tricks, born of hunger and cold. But deep down, something stirred, an instinct too old and powerful to ignore. He stood still, straining against the howling storm. Another whimper, this time louder, more urgent. It wasn't the wind. It was something alive, something vulnerable. Jacob's pulse quickened, cutting through the sluggish haze of his body. His eyes darted through the swirling snow, searching, questioning. He had no idea what he would find, but something inside whispered, "You have to look." Swallowing hard, Jacob forced his frozen legs to move. Every step toward the sound was a battle against instinct, against fear, against the desperate voice in his head telling him to save himself. But something deeper, something wounded and stubborn, pushed him forward. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was loneliness. Whatever it was, Jacob chose it. He chose connection over survival. The wind howled through the narrow alleyway, rattling loose shutters and sending frozen bits of trash skittering across the cracked pavement. Jacob tightened the thin scarf around his neck, his boots crunching in the brittle snow as he pressed forward, every breath a cloud in the bitter air. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. Survival had become a dull, aching rhythm. Then he froze. A sound, barely a whisper against the storm's fury. A whimper. Jacob turned, squinting through the swirling snow, heart hammering harder than the cold could explain. Behind an overflowing trash bin, something stirred. Another faint, broken whine. Cautiously, he approached, his instincts sharpened by the raw need to survive, and the equally raw fear of what he might find. What he found made him stagger back a step, his breath catching in his throat. Huddled against the bin, almost swallowed by a mound of snow and garbage, was a German shepherd puppy. Or what was left of one. Its fur clung in frozen clumps, its ribs sharp and cruel against the paper-thin skin. Ice matted the once proud coat, and the little body trembled with the last flickers of life. Its eyes, though glassy with pain and fear, locked onto Jacob's with a desperation so raw it carved into him deeper than any winter chill could. The pup whimpered again, a sound that was almost an apology for existing. Jacob knelt, reaching out a hesitant hand, but the puppy flinched weakly, its tiny frame folding inward. The streetlights overhead flickered, casting long, shivering shadows. For a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath around them. Jacob rocked back on his heels, hands trembling, not from the cold this time. He knew what it meant to make a promise to something so fragile. It wasn't just a meal or a night of warmth. It was a commitment to protect, to fight for another life when he could barely fight for his own. The streets had taught him survival was ruthless. Helping meant hurting yourself. Every mouth to feed was another nail in the coffin. His stomach cramped painfully, a sharp reminder that he didn't even have enough for himself. Still, the puppy's eyes, those pleading, broken eyes, clutched at something inside Jacob that hadn't completely died yet. He pressed his fists to his forehead, battling the rising tide of hopelessness. Jacob cursed under his breath, the sound torn away by the wind. He should walk away. It would be easier, cleaner. Survival was about hard choices, and walking away from pain was the easiest choice of all. But then something flickered inside him, a small, stubborn ember. Compassion, the kind that had once made him dream of better days, fought its way to the surface. He couldn't leave the puppy to die alone in the cold. He wouldn't. Jacob swallowed hard, blinking fiercely against the snow that stung his eyes. He shifted closer, speaking low and soft, letting the warmth of his voice be the first offering of trust. "Hey, buddy, I'm not going to hurt you." Slowly, Jacob shrugged off his only jacket, a tattered army surplus thing barely fit for the season, and draped it around the shivering puppy. The tiny creature gave a startled, pitiful squeak, but didn't resist. Instead, it collapsed into the sudden warmth with a fragile sign. Carefully, Jacob scooped the bundle into his arms, feeling how light, how wrongly light the puppy was. It was like carrying a memory rather than a living thing. He pressed the little body to his chest, sharing what heat he could, cradling the animal as if the world itself might try to tear them apart. For the first time in a long while, Jacob felt the undeniable pulse of another heartbeat against his own. And it mattered. With the puppy tucked against him, Jacob stumbled back into the storm. The city stretched out before him, an endless maze of shuttered shops, abandoned buildings, and faceless, frozen streets. Shelter wasn't a guarantee. Nothing was. But now it wasn't just about him. Every step he took was fueled by a fierce, desperate protectiveness. The snow seemed to fall harder, trying to erase their tracks, trying to make them disappear. Jacob clutched the puppy tighter, whispering to it even though he didn't know if it understood. "Hang on, little guy. Just hang on." They were two souls caught in a storm that didn't care if they lived or died, but together they had a chance. The night pressed in, heavy and merciless, but Jacob kept moving. Each breath felt like knives in his lungs, each step heavier than the last. Yet, with the puppy's fragile warmth nestled against his heart, a stubborn flicker of hope refused to die. Maybe survival wasn't just about endurance. Maybe it was about having someone or something to fight for. As he trudged toward the faint glow of a distant, broken-down shelter, Jacob whispered into the frozen night. A promise meant for both of them. "We're gonna make it, buddy, I swear." The stars hung like fragile lanterns in the frozen sky as Jacob crouched beside the shivering bundle of fur. His voice was raw from the cold, trembling with something deeper than the chill. Gently, he brushed the pup's matted fur back from its dull eyes. "You need a name," he murmured into the stillness, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile thread between them. He hesitated, feeling a strange lump rise in his throat. "Scout," he whispered, letting the name wrap around them like a promise. The little creature twitched at the sound, but didn't retreat. Jacob took it as a sign. A vow, unspoken, passed between them. He would protect this tiny soul with the last broken pieces of his heart. Scout. It was more than a name. It was a hope, a future Jacob hadn't dared imagine. As the bitter wind clawed at his worn coat, Jacob leaned closer, shielding Scout with his own battered body. Somewhere deep inside, something long frozen stirred. A flicker of belonging, fragile but real. Every time Jacob reached out, Scout shrank back, his tiny body quivering like a leaf in a storm. The scars marrying the pup's side told silent, brutal stories of a past laced with cruelty. Jacob ached to scoop him up, to promise it would never happen again, but he knew trust couldn't be forced. So he waited. Hours passed, sometimes entire nights, as Jacob simply sat nearby, his hands open, palms up, showing he meant no harm. He would hum old songs under his breath, low and soothing, weaving an invisible bridge between them. Sometimes Scout would inch closer, drawn by a trembling hope. Other times he would bolt at the smallest shift in Jacob's weight. It was a war waged not with weapons, but with patience and heartbreak. Jacob fought every instinct to rush the process, knowing that for Scout, every inch gained was a hard-won battle between fear and the first fragile whispers of trust. Under a battered street lamp, Jacob tore the last piece of stale bread into two uneven halves. Hunger gnawed at his belly, sharp and unrelenting, but he pushed the larger piece toward Scout, laying it gently on the cracked concrete. Scout hesitated, nose twitching, torn between hunger and terror. Jacob looked away, pretending not to watch, giving the pup the dignity of choice. Moments later, Scout crept forward, snatching the bread and retreating into the shadows to devour it in frantic bites. Jacob smiled faintly, the ache in his stomach dulled by a deeper warmth in his chest. This tiny, silent exchange was more than survival. It was an unspoken pact to weather the bitter nights and hungry mornings together, no matter how little they had. As Scout licked the last crumbs from his paws, Jacob leaned back against the cold stone wall, feeling the first fragile stitches of trust begin to sew their lives together. The night bled into an icy dawn, painting the world in bruised shades of gray. Jacob lay curled against a crumbling brick wall, his tattered coat barely a shield against the biting cold. Beside him, a trembling warmth pressed against his side. Scout, seeking solace without realizing he was giving it too. Their shivers, once chaotic and desperate, slowly found a rhythm, sinking in a fragile heart rate of survival. Jacob dared not move, afraid any sudden gesture would shatter the tentative peace Scout had offered. He closed his eyes, feeling the little body relax by degrees, as if the simple act of breathing together could forge something sacred. Under a sky indifferent to their struggle, two battered souls slept side by side, the first fragile threads of trust weaving a shelter stronger than any roof or wall could provide. Jacob's hands, raw and cracked from the cold, rested limply in his lap as the early morning mist curled around them. Scout, drawn by an instinct he couldn't yet understand, crept closer, inch by inch, his nose twitching at the faint scent of bread and sorrow. Without warning, Scout nudged Jacob's hand with his damp nose, then, with a trembling hesitation, offered a single, tentative lick across the rough skin. Jacob froze. Tears, hot and unbidden, blurred his vision. It was nothing. A touch so small it might have been missed, but to Jacob it cracked open something he thought had been sealed forever. He choked back a sob, pressing his forehead against Scout's small head, careful not to startle him. "Good boy," Jacob whispered, his voice breaking, his heart stitching itself back together with each shuddering breath. In that simple gesture, a lick, a touch, a trust freely given, the two lost souls found something neither had dared hope for: belonging. Every day was a brutal negotiation with hunger and cold. Jacob scavenged tirelessly, scraping together scraps from trash bins and leftovers abandoned by the uncaring world. Each morsel was divided instinctively now, half for him, half for Scout. Sometimes, when the pickings were especially meager, Jacob pretended he wasn't hungry at all, watching Scout devour the last crust with a pang of fierce, protective love. The city was a cruel battlefield, its alleys and streets offering more dangers than shelter. But together they navigated it, one cautious step, one hollow-bellied day at a time. The fight was no longer just Jacob's, it was theirs, shared and stubborn, stitched together by loyalty stronger than any chain. And as bleak as the days were, Jacob found a strange kind of purpose in them. He was needed, he mattered. Scout depended on him, and he would not fail him. They became a fixture of the city's margins, a ragged man and a scrappy pup, bound by a loyalty that was invisible to passing eyes. Muttered comments followed them through the streets. People clutched their bags tighter, crossed to the other side, looked away, as if Jacob carried something contagious. "Poor dog," a woman once sneered, loud enough for Jacob to hear. "Someone should rescue it." Jacob's jaw tightened, shame and fury warring inside him. Didn't they see? He had rescued Scout, and in doing so, Scout had rescued him too. As the cold wind stung his face, Jacob pulled Scout closer under his coat. The world could judge them all it wanted. What mattered wasn't what strangers saw. It was the quiet loyalty in Scout's eyes, the trust that no wealth, no home, no fine clothes could ever buy. The nights were the hardest. When the city lights flickered out and the streets emptied, doubts crept into Jacob's mind like cold fingers. Was he doing right by Scout? Was love enough when hunger gnawed so fiercely and shelter was just a crumbling cardboard box? He stared at the pup curled against his chest, feeling the tiny heartbeat against his ribs. Could Scout have had a better life with someone else? Someone with a warm home, steady meals, safety? Jacob's chest tightened painfully. Maybe keeping him was selfish. Maybe he was condemning Scout to the same endless struggle he himself had known for so long. Yet, when he shifted, Scout stirred, letting out a soft, contented sigh. And for a fleeting moment, Jacob allowed himself to believe. Maybe love was enough. Maybe it was everything. Morning crept across the city in pale, weary light. Jacob stirred awake to find Scout watching him, eyes steady, full of a quiet trust that words could never capture. It hit Jacob like a wave. This tiny creature, battered by life, still chose him, chose to stay. No one had looked at Jacob that way in a long time, not without judgment, not without fear. Scout's gaze didn't flinch. It didn't matter, it simply was fierce and unwavering. A lump swelled in Jacob's throat. He pressed a hand gently against Scout's scruffy fur, feeling the life thrumming beneath it. Scout wasn't just his companion. He was the keeper of Jacob's battered, stubborn heart, the part of him that still believed in loyalty, in hope, in tomorrow. And Jacob vowed, silently and fiercely, he would never betray that trust. As days blurred into nights and back again, Jacob found himself talking to Scout more and more. Not just simple commands or comforting hums, but real conversations. Memories, regrets, dreams he thought he'd long buried. Sitting under an abandoned awning one rainy afternoon, Jacob chuckled hoarsely. "Used to dream about fixing motorcycles," he said, rubbing Scout's damp fur, riding across the country, feeling free. Scout tilted his head as if listening, understanding more than words could say. Talking aloud stitched pieces of Jacob's broken soul back together, thread by thread. In Scout's silent companionship there was no judgment, no pity, only acceptance. And in those rambling talks, Jacob began to remember who he had been and who he might still become. Jacob dared to dream again, a real job, a tiny apartment, maybe even enough money for a real leash instead of the frayed rope he used. Scout deserved better, and for the first time, Jacob believed he might be able to give it to him. But as they turned down a side alley one evening, Scout froze, his body rigid with terror. His hackles rose, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within his chest. Jacob followed Scout's gaze, and his heart plummeted. A shadow detached itself from the darkness. A man, familiar in the worst possible way, stepped into the light. Recognition flashed cruel and sharp across his sneer. Scout whimpered low, pressing against Jacob's leg. The past, the one they had both fought so hard to outrun, had found them, and it wasn't here for peace. The night air was thick with tension, as Jacob held Scout tightly by his side, his eyes scanning the dimly lit alleyway. The wind howled, carrying the sounds of a far-off storm, but it was the sudden crunch of footsteps on the gravel that froze him in place. A shadow moved toward them, a rough-looking man, his features obscured by the low-hanging streetlights. The man's eyes burned with a ferocity that made Jacob's pulse quicken, and when he spoke his voice was sharp, demanding. "You! That's my dog!" the man barked, his finger pointing directly at Scout. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He instinctively stepped closer to Scout, an immediate protective instinct surging within him. The air felt thicker now, charged with something dangerous. The man took a step forward, his movements aggressive, as his voice grew louder. "That dog's mine," he insisted, his words laced with anger and entitlement. "I've been looking for her for weeks. She ran off from me, but she's mine. You have no right to keep her." Jacob's stomach churned. The claim made no sense. This was Scout, a dog that had been abandoned, a dog who had found him, who had chosen him. Yet the man's intensity made Jacob hesitate. Was this truly Scout's past? The fear in her eyes seemed to suggest so. Scout's body stiffened, her eyes wide with terror as she cowered closer to Jacob. A low whimper escaped her throat, and she pressed herself against his legs, trembling violently. The once strong, confident dog Jacob had come to love was reduced to a quivering mess. Her reaction hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a case of a stray dog being found. It was a moment that revealed the depth of her past trauma. The fear in her eyes spoke volumes, confirming what Jacob had feared. Scout had known cruelty before. The man's eyes narrowed as he took another step forward, his voice dripping with menace. "Hand her over now," he growled. "If you don't, you'll regret it. I'll make sure of it." Jacob's heart raced as the tension escalated. His mind spun, considering every possibility. The anger in the man's voice made it clear that this wasn't just an argument, it was a threat. And the way Scout was reacting, cowering behind him, told Jacob everything he needed to know. He couldn't let this man take her. Jacob's mind was a whirlwind. Fear gnawed at him, but it wasn't just fear for himself. His thoughts raced between protecting Scout and trying to avoid escalating the situation. What if this man was armed? What if things got violent? He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He glanced down at Scout, who was still shaking, her eyes locked on the man, fear evident in every line of her body. This wasn't just about the dog. It was about trust, loyalty, and doing what was right. Jacob's breath caught as he made a decision. Without thinking about his own safety, he stood tall and planted himself firmly between Scout and the man. "No," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "You're not taking her. She's not yours." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The man's eyes flashed with anger, but Jacob didn't budge. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his resolve was unwavering. This wasn't just about protecting a dog. It was about protecting someone who had come to trust him with everything. Jacob's gaze darted around, his mind desperate for a solution. He spotted a police officer across the street, standing by his car, and his heart surged with hope. With shaky hands, Jacob pulled out his phone and quickly dialed the number for the police. His voice trembled as he spoke, but he didn't let fear take over. "I need help," he said urgently. "There's a man here. He says the dog's his, but I think she's in danger. Please, you need to come." The connection clicked as he hung up, but he didn't let his eyes leave the man, keeping a protective stance in front of Scout. Just as Jacob felt his nerves start to crack, something unexpected happened. Scout, who had been cowering behind him moments before, stepped forward. Her body stood tall, and a low, warning growl rumbled from her throat. Jacob was taken aback. This was the first time he had heard her make such a sound. It wasn't the trembling, scared dog from before. This was a dog who had seen fear, but also had the courage to stand up for herself and for Jacob. The man paused, his gaze faltering for just a moment, before he sneered and took another step forward. Moments later, the police arrived, their sirens cutting through the night air. They quickly took control of the situation, questioning the man, whose demeanor only grew more erratic with every question. As the officers investigated, they uncovered a chilling history. Records of animal abuse that tied this man to a pattern of cruelty. The officers found signs of Scout's past torment in her eyes, in the way she flinched at sudden movements. Her injuries weren't just physical. They were emotional scars left by someone who had never understood the true nature of love and companionship. With a pair of cold handcuffs snapping into place, the man was led away in silence. Jacob watched, his heart still racing but starting to calm as the danger faded. He turned to Scout, who was now sitting beside him, her body tense but her eyes softer. The moment felt surreal, the fear and uncertainty dissipating as justice was served. As the man was escorted to the police car, Jacob let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They were safe. In the stillness that followed, Scout gently approached Jacob. She nudged her nose into his hand, and he instinctively reached down, running his fingers through her fur. Without a single word, Jacob felt the bond between them solidify. She had trusted him with her life, and he had done the same. They had fought together, they had won together. And in that moment, with the warmth of her fur against his skin, Jacob made a silent promise to her, and to himself, that he would always protect her. Scout licked his hand, her eyes full of gratitude, and Jacob's heart swelled with an unspoken understanding. No words were needed. They were a team now, forever bound by loyalty, love, and an unbreakable bond. Jacob was still processing the day's events when his phone buzzed. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the unknown number flashing on the screen. It was a local rescue organization. They'd heard about Scout's story from the shelter staff, and, moved by his bravery, they wanted to help. They offered assistance, including medical care for Scout and a potential home for him, something Jacob had been struggling to provide alone. The relief in Jacob's chest was immediate. Finally, someone was offering real help, just when he needed it most. The next morning, Jacob arrived at the rescue shelter with Scout by his side. The place was warm, filled with the comforting sounds of dogs and people working together. Jacob was struck by the kindness in the faces of the staff, each one welcoming him with a sense of understanding that made him feel like he belonged too. The staff walked him through the process, ensuring that Scout was given a thorough checkup while Jacob was offered a space to sit and reflect. For the first time in a long while, Jacob felt like he wasn't fighting alone. There was no judgment here, only acceptance, and it was a relief Jacob hadn't realized he needed. As the day unfolded, the shelter staff offered Jacob something unexpected: a part-time job to help with the animals and a room to stay in at the shelter's residential area. They could sense Jacob's struggle, and in their generosity, they gave him the opportunity to start fresh. He couldn't believe it at first, his mind racing at the thought of stability, something he hadn't experienced in so long. It wasn't just an offer of shelter or work. It was a lifeline, a chance to rebuild. Scout settled into the shelter's safe environment with ease. The team worked to provide him with medical care, and soon he was thriving under their attention and love. No longer frightened or hungry, Scout began to show the playful, joyful spirit Jacob had always known was there. It was as if Scout had found his place in the world at last, and Jacob couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. Watching Scout run freely, Jacob realized that his companion was getting the life he deserved, one of safety, care, and love. As the weeks went by, Jacob's own transformation began. Surrounded by rescued animals who had once known pain but now were full of hope, and with the constant support of the shelter staff, Jacob started to open up. The walls he'd built around his heart began to crumble. Every day, he found himself trusting more. Trusting in people again, trusting in the possibility of a future that didn't revolve around loss and pain. It was small steps, but with every interaction he found his soul healing, piece by piece. Jacob and Scout's bond deepened with each passing day. Their lives had been defined by struggle and survival, but now they were healing together. Jacob laughed at Scout's goofy antics and felt the warmth of unconditional love in the moments they shared. Scout, in turn, was always by Jacob's side, his unwavering loyalty reminding Jacob that not all relationships were built on betrayal or pain. Together, they were no longer just survivors. They were thriving, stronger than ever, and completely inseparable. One sunny afternoon, Jacob took Scout for a walk in the park. The cool breeze, the soft rustle of leaves. It was a simple moment, but one that had eluded Jacob for years. As they walked, a young child approached, gazing at Scout with wide eyes. "He's beautiful," the child said, smiling up at Jacob. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jacob felt something stir within him. He smiled, really smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached his eyes. It was the first time in years he had allowed himself to experience joy without hesitation. The world didn't feel so heavy at that moment. Jacob and Scout's story quickly became an inspiration to others at the shelter. They were no longer just survivors. They were living proof of the power of love, healing, and second chances. The other animals, too, found hope in Jacob and Scout's journey. They saw that recovery was possible, that love could heal the deepest wounds. It was a quiet, unspoken strength that emanated from their bond, and slowly the atmosphere in the shelter began to change. More hopeful, more vibrant, and full of possibility. As the sun began to set one evening, casting long golden rays across the shelter grounds, Jacob stood with Scout at his side. They looked out at the horizon, the future stretching ahead of them, bright and full of promise. The years of uncertainty, the pain, and the darkness. They felt so distant now. With Scout by his side, Jacob knew that the future was theirs to claim, and for the first time, he was ready to embrace it. The journey had been long and difficult, but together, they had found the love and healing that had been missing from their lives. Jacob never imagined that saving Scout would be the key to filling the emptiness he had carried for so long. He had come to believe that healing wasn't possible for someone like him, that he was destined to live with the broken pieces of his past. But with every wag of Scout's tail, every trusting glance, Jacob began to feel something he thought was long gone. Purpose. He had given the dog a chance, but in return, Scout had given him back the parts of himself he thought had been lost forever. The simple act of saving Scout had filled the void inside him in ways he couldn't even begin to describe. Scout didn't just survive the trauma of his past, he was healing too. And Jacob, in the quiet moments spent together, learned that Scout wasn't the only one who had been broken. There was a time when Jacob's laughter felt like a distant memory, his hope buried beneath layers of grief. But with Scout by his side, those emotions slowly began to resurface. Scout had not only helped him rediscover trust, but it also reminded him of the small joys that make life worth living. What had started as an act of rescue had blossomed into a shared journey of mutual healing. It was never about grand gestures or life-changing decisions. Jacob had simply seen a dog in need, a soul wandering without direction, and he'd acted with compassion. He never could have predicted the profound impact this small, kind action would have on his own life. By rescuing Scout, Jacob unknowingly ignited a chain of events that would transform both their lives. Sometimes, it's the smallest acts of kindness that plant the seeds for the most beautiful transformations, and neither Jacob nor Scout could have imagined how much that moment would change everything. Jacob had spent years hiding his scars, both visible and invisible. But with Scout, he learned that opening his heart, even after it had been shattered, was the first step toward rebuilding it. Compassion had seeped into the cracks of his broken soul, slowly mending him in ways he never thought possible. Scout's unconditional love had given him the courage to trust again, to open up to the possibility of healing, and to believe that even after everything he had been through, there was still room for joy, for connection, and for love. As Jacob and Scout walked together into the golden glow of the setting sun, they felt an unspoken understanding between them. The journey had been difficult, but it had brought them here to a place of peace and mutual understanding, What had started as a simple rescue had grown into something far more profound. Jacob realized that second chances, for both humans and animals, were more than just hopeful possibilities. They were miracles in the making. With Scout at his side, he finally understood that hope was never lost. It just had to be rediscovered, one step at a time. And in that moment, as the world around them softened into the twilight, Jacob knew he had found the healing he had been searching for all along.